The flicker of the bulb cast ominous shadows on the cracked paint of her rustic country home. The storm outside was relentless. It had started as a soft pattering of rain, but over time it had evolved into an orchestral thunderstorm. Having grown up in this secluded farmhouse, Jessica was no stranger to the forces of nature. But tonight was different. The wind was stronger, the thunder louder, and the lightning seemed to be aiming for the house. Jessica watched the storm from her window, a cup of warm tea in her hand. Suddenly, the house plunged into darkness. An audible gasp escaped Jessica as she almost dropped her cup. The blackout had come without warning, accompanied by a thunderclap so loud it was as if the heavens themselves were splitting apart. Jessica fumbled for her phone. She opened the flashlight app and tried to locate the emergency lanterns she knew were somewhere in the living room. She found one, dusted it off, and switched it on, casting an eerie glow around the room. As she returned to the window, the storm seemed to grow in intensity. It was unusual for the weather to turn so violent in the area. Her eyes fell on the old barn across the yard, illuminated intermittently by lightning flashes. In the flickering light, the barn appeared stranger, more ominous. Suddenly, she noticed a figure moving swiftly towards the barn. In that split second, Jessica felt her heart pounding. It was a man, his outline barely visible in the torrential rain. She strained her eyes to see more clearly, but the darkness was suffocating. She quickly locked the front door and ran upstairs to her bedroom. She had to call for help, but when she tried dialing the local police station, the call wouldn't go through. Her cell showed no service. The storm must have knocked out the tower. Anxiety gnawed at Jessica as she paced her room. The man was still out there, potentially a threat. She decided to arm herself. Her father had left her an old hunting rifle when he passed. She had never used it, but now she felt grateful for it. Armed and wary, she crept back to the window. This time, the figure was nowhere to be seen. He must have taken shelter in the barn, she thought. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw a faint glow emitting from the barn. It was a light, moving rhythmically around the interior. The man was inside. Suddenly, Jessica heard a loud bang at the door. She jumped, nearly dropping the rifle. Her heart pounded as she descended the stairs. The banging continued, growing louder with each thud. "Open up!" a man's voice cried from the other side of the door. Her grip tightened on the rifle. She approached the door cautiously. "I need help," the voice pleaded, sounding frantic and desperate. Jessica steeled herself, unlocked the door, and swung it open. The man fell forward, landing on her hallway floor. He was drenched, his clothes clinging to his body, and he was shaking uncontrollably. He had a deep cut on his forehead, and his eyes were wide with fear. There's something in the barn," he stammered. Confused, Jessica asked, "What do you mean?" "A creature. Inhuman. I got lost in the storm and took shelter in the barn, but then—" He trailed off, shivering. With sudden realization, Jessica's blood ran cold. All the anomalies of the night fell into place. The raging storm, the blackout, the man seeking shelter, they were all pieces of a terrifying puzzle. She looked at the man, the rifle still clutched in her hand, and then to the barn, its ominous shadow looming under the chaotic sky. She knew they weren't alone. The rural silence was no longer comforting, but a haunting reminder of their isolation and the monstrous entity that now shared it with them. Their long night was only beginning. Overwhelmed by fear, Jessica helped the man onto the worn-out couch in her living room. She fetched a first aid kit and began tending to his wound. "Are you sure it wasn't just an animal?" Jessica asked, trying to steady her voice. "I've seen animals, ma'am. This was not one," he replied, eyes still wide with terror. His gaze was fixed on the door as if expecting the creature to burst through any moment. A sudden high-pitched screech echoed from outside. Both of them froze. It was an unnatural, ear-splitting noise that neither of them had ever heard before. Jessica clenched her teeth. "The lantern," the man said abruptly. "It attracts it. When I switched it on in the barn, it appeared." Jessica looked at the lantern in her living room, its soft glow suddenly seeming menacing. She hurriedly switched it off. Their eyes took a few seconds to adjust to the darkness, but they remained silent, straining to hear any noise over the sound of the storm. A sudden thud on the roof broke the silence. It was followed by another and another, a series of heavy footfalls, as if a colossal beast was traversing the roof. They both looked up, eyes wide, barely daring to breathe. Slowly the man stood up, gesturing to Jessica to stay behind. He picked up a heavy iron poker from the fireplace and moved cautiously towards the front door. He took a deep breath, swung it open, and stepped outside. Jessica watched anxiously from the doorway as the man looked around. He shone his flashlight towards the barn, but the beam of light revealed nothing but the driving rain and the old wooden structure. Suddenly, a lightning bolt illuminated the scene, and for a split second Jessica saw it, a large, grotesque figure crouched on the roof, its eyes reflecting the light like a predator in the night. It was a momentary glimpse, but it was enough to send a shiver down her spine. She raised her rifle, her hands shaking. "Look out!" she screamed. The creature leaped from the roof, landing right in front of the man, its monstrous form briefly outlined by another flash of lightning. The man swung the iron poker at the creature. There was a guttural cry, and the creature recoiled, giving Jessica a clear shot. She took a deep breath and pulled the trigger. The gunshot echoed across the open fields, momentarily overpowering the storm. The creature let out a spine-chilling roar before slumping to the ground. The man dropped the poker, panting heavily. They both stood in silence, staring at the creature's form. It looked like nothing they'd ever seen before, a grotesque, twisted form that was a perversion of nature. The storm seemed to recede, and the silence of the countryside returned. Jessica lowered her rifle, feeling a sense of relief washing over her. They were safe, at least for now. As the sun rose, casting away the darkness, they managed to reach out to the authorities, who arrived with biologists and special containment units. The creature was identified as an unknown species, possibly mutated or extraterrestrial. Jessica's home became the center of a media frenzy, but despite the chaos, she couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. They had faced their fears, and they had survived the most terrifying night of their lives.